For decades, Linux has lived with a strange contradiction. It has powered the internet, dominated servers, run the world's fastest supercomputers, and quietly controlled billions of devices in our pockets and homes. Yet on the desktop it has always carried a reputation that sounded almost unfairly small compared to its massive achievements. People would say it was powerful but complicated, flexible but fragmented, free but inconvenient. The same sentence kept showing up in forums, tech reviews, and conversations between curious newcomers. Linux is great, but it has one big weakness, and depending on who you asked, that weakness had different names. Software compatibility, gaming, drivers, ease of use, app availability, fragmentation. The list changed, but the conclusion stayed the same. Linux was always almost perfect, almost ready, almost there. Now something different is happening. The tone of the conversation is shifting. Instead of asking whether Linux can replace Windows or macOS, people are quietly installing it and realizing they don't need to go back. Instead of treating Linux like an experiment, they're treating it like a daily driver. And for the first time in a long time, it's fair to ask a bold question that once sounded ridiculous. Has Linux finally lost its biggest weakness? To understand why this question even matters, you have to rewind a bit and remember what using Linux used to feel like. Installing it often meant burning a DVD, or wrestling with strange partitioning tools. Your Wi-Fi card might not work out of the box. Your graphics drivers required manual downloads and mysterious commands. If you wanted basic apps, you'd open a package manager that looked like a spreadsheet from 2004. And if you needed something mainstream like Adobe Photoshop, Microsoft Office, or a popular game, the answer was usually a shrug followed by the phrase, "There's an alternative." Alternatives are fine until they become compromises. People didn't want an alternative to the software their work depended on. They wanted the actual thing. Students didn't want an alternative to their favorite games. They wanted their games. Businesses didn't want to retrain employees around unfamiliar tools. They wanted compatibility. That was Linux's biggest weakness, in one word, friction. Every time someone tried Linux, there was friction between what they expected and what actually worked. Over time, Linux improved in hundreds of small ways. Installers became simpler. Hardware support grew better. Desktops like GNOME and KDE started looking modern. But the core problem remained. You could do almost everything on Linux, yet you often had to do it differently. And different is often enough to scare people away. Then something changed, and it didn't happen all at once. It happened quietly, piece by piece, until one day you realized the excuses didn't sound convincing anymore. Take software compatibility, the most obvious pain point. For years, the question was simple. Can Linux run the apps people already use? The answer used to be not really. Wine existed, but it was hit or miss. Some apps worked, others crashed, and setting it up felt like black magic. Today, that story is completely different. Wine matured. Projects like Proton appeared. Valve poured money and engineering effort into making Windows games run seamlessly on Linux. Suddenly, thousands of titles that once required complicated tweaks started launching with a single click. Gamers noticed first. The Steam Deck played a huge role here. Valve couldn't ship a Linux-based handheld unless games actually worked. So they built compatibility layers that were so good that many players didn't even realize they were using Linux underneath. The result was shocking. Games that once required Windows just ran. Sometimes they even ran better. Performance was competitive. Setup was automatic. For the average user, the old Linux can't game argument simply stopped being true. But it didn't stop at games. Productivity apps began moving to the web. Microsoft Office became Office 365. Adobe tools gained browser versions. Collaboration tools like Slack, Zoom, Discord, and Teams all offered native Linux builds or web apps that worked flawlessly. The software landscape itself shifted in Linux's favor. Instead of Linux chasing Windows compatibility, the world moved toward platform-agnostic software. This change is subtle, but huge. If your work happens in a browser, your operating system suddenly matters a lot less. Linux doesn't have to replicate every Windows app if those apps live online anyway. The old weakness dissolves not because Linux copied Windows, but because computing evolved past the need for strict OS loyalty. At the same time, Linux distributions started learning something important about users. People don't want to tinker just to get basic things done. They want things to work. Distros like Linux Mint, Ubuntu, Pop_OS, and Fedora began focusing heavily on polish. Installers became friendly and guided. Drivers installed automatically. Software stores looked clean and modern. Flatpak and Snap made app distribution easier and more consistent. Instead of hunting dependencies in forums, you could just click install. This is where another historic weakness, fragmentation, started shrinking. In the past, each distro felt like a different planet. Now, containerized formats mean an app built for one system often runs everywhere. Developers no longer have to target 10 package systems. Users no longer worry whether something is compatible. That invisible glue made Linux feel more unified, even if technically it's still diverse underneath. Hardware support followed a similar path. Manufacturers once ignored Linux completely. Now many companies ship laptops with Linux pre-installed. Drivers are integrated directly into the kernel. Plugging in a printer or a game controller often just works. Wi-Fi chips that once caused headaches are now recognized instantly. The average user doesn't even think about drivers anymore, which is exactly how it should be. Perhaps the biggest change isn't technical at all. It's psychological. Years ago, installing Linux felt like joining a niche club. You had to read guides, learn commands, and accept rough edges. Today, someone can install Linux, Mint, or Ubuntu, and use it exactly like any other modern OS. Open browser, log into accounts, install apps, done. The barrier to entry has collapsed. And when the barrier collapses, perception changes. Linux stops feeling like an experiment and starts feeling normal. Of course, it's not perfect. No operating system is. But the question isn't whether Linux is flawless. The question is whether its biggest historic weakness still meaningfully exists. When most common apps run, when most games work, when hardware is supported, and when setup is easy, what exactly is left to complain about? Some will say professional software is still an issue. That's partly true. Certain niche tools, especially in creative industries, still favor Windows or Mac OS, but even that gap is shrinking. Alternatives have matured. Cloud tools replace desktop apps, and many professionals are discovering they don't actually need those legacy programs as often as they thought. Others will point to fragmentation again. Yet for most users, fragmentation is invisible. They pick one distro and never think about the others. It's like choosing between Android phones. Variety isn't a weakness anymore. It's just choice. Security and privacy, ironically once seen as Linux's strengths, are now becoming major selling points. In a world of telemetry and forced updates, Linux feels refreshingly respectful. You control your system. You decide what gets installed. There's a growing group of users who aren't switching because Linux finally caught up, but because Windows and Mac OS moved in directions they dislike. Linux didn't just fix its weaknesses. Competitors introduced new ones. This flips the narrative completely. Instead of Linux chasing mainstream acceptance, mainstream users are looking for an escape route, and Linux happens to be ready. Imagine telling someone 10 years ago that you could install Linux, log into Steam, download your favorite AAA games, run Discord, edit videos, attend Zoom meetings, use Office in the browser, and never touch the terminal. They probably wouldn't believe you. Yet that's everyday reality now. So has Linux finally lost its biggest weakness? Maybe the more accurate answer is that the world changed in a way that made that weakness irrelevant. Compatibility used to mean running Windows apps. Now compatibility means running web apps and cross-platform tools. Linux excels at that. What we're witnessing isn't just technical progress. It's a quiet maturity. Linux doesn't feel like it's trying to prove itself anymore. It just works. And when an operating system reaches the point where you stop thinking about it, that's when you know it has succeeded. For the first time, recommending Linux to a beginner doesn't require a long list of warnings. You don't have to say, but this might break, or that might not work. You can simply say, try it. That confidence would have been unthinkable years ago. There will always be edge cases and power users who run into limitations. That's inevitable. But for the vast majority of everyday tasks, Linux no longer feels like a compromise. It feels like a choice. And sometimes, it even feels like the better one. Maybe that's the real answer. Linux didn't just lose its biggest weakness. It outgrew the question entirely.